right, well, good evening, everyone. I am Jocelyn Bowling-Dixon, Director of the Newark Public Library. Thank you so much for joining us for the inaugural discussion that is part of the library's important new series called Keeping It Real, Conversations about Race, Gender, and Class. This series of timely panel discussions is sponsored by the Philip Roth Endowment, which is part of the author's generous gift to the library and his hometown, Newark, New Jersey. I am so excited to announce that in June that the Philip Roth Library will be open here at the main branch. So I hope you all will come check us out. So considered to be by many to be one of the greatest American novelists of the 20th century, Roth found his footing in the world of ideas and language through the books he discovered right here at the library. Libraries, of course, are about advancing and sharing knowledge. We also provide a safe space to explore and better understand the issues that sometimes challenge, divide, and confuse us. As a library, we believe open, honest discussions such as these that we anticipate having in our Keeping It Real series are beneficial to all of us and a fitting legacy for a thought-provoking author such as Roth. Tonight's topic is why we need to talk about race, justice, and Asian Americans. Unfortunately, this is a really topical subject. As you probably know, North Jersey is home to some of the largest Asian American communities in the country. And as the pandemic spread across the state last year, the number of anti-Asian bias incidents, including racial slurs and physical attacks, increased a stunning 75%. Professors Khatri, Joshi, and Tammy Ho will talk about the history of anti-Asian violence and exclusion in the United States and how we can learn to promote community safety, wellness, and justice. I will now turn it over to our librarian of the Philip Roth Personal Library, Nadine Sergeyev, who will introduce our panelists. Nadine?
Yes, thank you, and welcome for joining us. I'd like to introduce you first to Dr. Khatri Joshi, Professor of Education at Fairleigh Dickinson University, a social science researcher whose work focuses on the intersections of race and religion in the United States, and co-author of Jersey Promises, a report on the state of Asian America in New Jersey. She is frequently called upon for presentations for policymakers, thought leaders, and the business community. Professor Joshi has appeared on MSNBC, C-SPAN, CBS, CNA, which is Channel News Asia Singapore, and has been interviewed on radio, Voice of America, PRI's The World, and NPR's Morning Edition, and numerous NPR affiliates around the country, and has been quoted in publications in the US and abroad. Her most recent book is White Christian Privilege, The Illusion of Religious Equality in America, published by NYU Press 2020. Our second presenter is Dr. Tammy Ho, an associate professor of gender and sexuality studies at the University of California, Riverside. She was born in Burma, in other words known as Myanmar, and grew up in Southern California in the unceded lands of the Tongva, Cahuilla, Luiseno, and Serrano peoples. She received her PhD in comparative literature from UCLA and is an interdisciplinary scholar who works in Asian American studies and teaches classes that include Native, Indigenous, Black, and Chicana writers and scholars. She is currently working on 2 research projects related to Asian American intergenerational stories and Burmese food and migration. And before we begin, please note that there will be a Q&A at the end and that you can submit your questions at any time during this program. Thank you, and allow me to introduce Drs. Joshi and Dr. Ho.
Thank you. Delighted to be here at the Newark Public Library, and especially it's a treat having my friend and colleague, Professor Tammy Ho from University of California, Riverside, to be in conversation with. We're going to be talking about Asian Americans and racial justice, and really to start it off, we have to start with someplace really basic, which is who are Asian Pacific Americans, right? We are a bit broad and diverse bunch. We're talking about over 50 nationalities. We're talking about, as I said the other day, a number of languages I can't even count. People of different religious backgrounds. We're also talking about, when we talk about think about the population today, we're also talking about differences in intergenerational differences. Folks who came here soon after our doors opened up with the Immigration Act of 1965, and then settled and made homes and had families, established families. And we're also talking about folks who are in their 50s and 60s who've come in the late 80s and the early 90s or 10 years ago. Many of us were born here. Many of us came here as babies. Like Tammy, I was also born elsewhere. I was born in India. So the sheer heterogeneity of Asian Pacific America has to be understood. And, you know, there's a lot there. I will say that, you know, and you know, Tammy, you could probably comment on this too. I kind of, it's, I struggle sometimes. I'm really happy and sometimes I'm really struggling with all the emphasis and importance placed on hearing from Asian Pacific Americans. Because a year ago, actually, so many people weren't listening. And now people are listening because of the fact that we have recorded over 6,000 hate incidences as recorded by Stop AAPI Hate. We have the unfortunate murders of the 6 Asian American women in Atlanta, Georgia. And I think, you know, why does it have to come to such tragedy for people to take, for people to pay attention to who's here, you know, and who makes up this country. So it's exciting. At the same time, I struggle, you know, and I kind of have both feelings simultaneously. You know, we hear about anti-Asian hate today. And I just talked about those numbers. By the way, by March 15th, it was about 3,000 hate incidences, 3,300 hate incidences that had been recorded, and it literally doubled from there till today, on May 6th, when AAPI Hate put out their most recent report. And so it's really important to understand how it's manifesting, and the fact that when we talk about anti-Asian hate, there's a couple of things I want you all to keep in mind. Actually, anti-Asian hate, even in contemporary life, has been there for a while. We have to connect what happened to South Asian Americans post 9/11 with what's happening today in terms of the targeting of largely our East Asian American, Southeast Asian American, Pacific Islander communities. You know, all of this has to be seen together and understood together. We had the murder of 6 Asian American women, and then we had the murder of 6 Sikh Americans in Indianapolis, right? So these are not separate in one sense. We have to think about them together. And unfortunately, this violence against Asian Pacific American communities is nothing new. We have seen it before. We can trace back to actually the image that comes to mind is back from 1882. There was an image that showed the ghost of Chinatown out of San Francisco, and it was like the ghost of malaria, the ghost of smallpox, and the ghost of leprosy, right? Asian immigrants were often thought to be carriers of disease, actually a lot of other immigrants as well. So this idea of Chinese and Asians being dirty, carriers of disease, people we need to keep away from, people that cause problems, isn't anything new. And I think that you know, those connections have to be made, and those connections have to be made in education, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So, you know, it's as somebody who's been focused on Asian American studies for over 20 years, it certainly feels like you know, a different world. And yet at the same time, the questions I'm often asked are the same. And one of the things, Tammy, I wondered if you could I wonder what your take is. I feel that Asian Pacific Americans are really impacted by 2 particular stereotypes. That of the forever foreigner, right? The notion that doesn't matter if you're 3rd, 4th, 5th generation Asian American in this country, you're seen as from over there. And the stereotype of the model minority. the idea of course, that all Asian kids do really well in math and science and don't create ruckus and, just, obey the teachers and listen attentively and do really well, right, in school. And I'm focused on education, so I'll bring it up in school. But of course, I think it affects lots of people in the workplace too. So I was wondering what you thought about that in terms of both those stereotypes kind of still constantly being associated with Asian Pacific America.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. You're absolutely right in the way in which, the kind of hypervisibility of being marked kind of forever foreign or always alien, inassimilable, exotic, is coupled with the kind of invisibility of being kind of the quote model minority, right? And I was actually just having a conversation this weekend with my niece who's 20 years old and going to college and studying US history. And she was telling me about, her recent research on the bubonic plague and, 1800s notions of disease and pathogens, being in Chinatown, right? As you mentioned, Kathy, this notion that Asian bodies, are unclean, that we are vectors of danger, vectors of disease, vectors of immorality, right? In terms of the way in which immigration in the late 1800s and early 1900s really regulated Asian women, particularly from immigrating to the United States, unless they were formally married, right? And the stereotype that Asian women were sex workers and prostitutes. And the issue of the model minority, actually, for me, really is it was actually one of the kind of galvanizing moments for me as a young adult and college student. So when I was going to college in the 1980s, late 1980s, I came across a GQ article that talked about how Asian women were the ultimate accessory for the young up and coming financial CEO, right? So young white men who wanted to do well in corporate America were advised that having an Asian girlfriend on their arm would make them look kind of fancy and yet normative, right? When I was going through college, there was Black studies, there was women's studies, and there was Chicano studies, but there were no Asian American programs, at least at my liberal arts college in California. And so when we went to the administration to try and ask for resources, a class, a teacher, some resources like the other students of color got, the administration actually told us, well, the Asians don't need that because they're the happy minority. And I mean, we were graphically told, you are the model minority. And it really speaks to the way in which Asians were positioned kind of against the quote troublesome, minorities of brown and Black students who, of course, coming out of civil rights and third world liberation movements, had been advocating for expanding, opening the doors of education and opportunity in the United States. So I think absolutely. But the other thing too about the forever foreigner thing is that it's not only back in the 1800s. We all know the ways in which obviously COVID has been associated with Asian bodies, which, of course, has fed into the rates of violence that you mentioned, Kathy, but also the ways in which Southeast Asians, like Cambodians, for example, Laotians, have been recently deported, and Korean Americans, right, recently deported over the last, 5 years, even though they've spent their entire lives here. So, I think Asian Americans, unfortunately, are all too aware that our presence in this country is always kind of on a thin wire, right, between Japanese American internment, which stripped civil rights from, American-born Japanese Americans, to today, these kind of threats of deportation, especially if, somebody is has a criminal record and, is a kind of easy target in times of political and economic crisis. One thing that, for me, that kind of highlights the way in which Asians are not always rewarded for being model minorities is last December, a friend of mine who was a 30-year-old Filipino immigrant who had served in the Navy and had been medically discharged, was going through a mental health crisis in Northern California. And his sister called the police, his 19-year-old sister called the police because she was scared, and, he was acting a little bit, out of the norm. And so by the time the police came, his mother had calmed him down, and yet the police kneeled on him much in the same way that we've seen and know too well in the George Floyd case. And unfortunately, he died 2 days later in the hospital. So he was unconscious after the police kneeled on him, and then he passed away in the hospital. So the case of Angelo Quinto in Filipino American activism and networks at this point has become a kind of galvanizing incident to remind us of the need and the ways in which Asian American lives are, tied to and part of the fabric of folks of color that are often called BIPOC in the United States today, right? Black, Indigenous, people of color. But speaking of race, I was, one of the things I actually loved about your book, and I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about it, is in your book, White Christian Privilege. One of the things I love about it is the way you talk about the optical illusion of religious equality in the United States, and particularly the way in which you unpack Supreme Court cases like Ozawa and Thind, right, which really highlight how the legal terms of what is considered white has flipped back and forth in US history and law, right? So I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about that book project in terms of what were you trying to accomplish, and now that the book's been out for a little while, kind of what's the response? Because I know you've done a few book talks with schools and public events. So could you chat a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, it really kind of stemmed out of the work so many of us have been doing in terms of connecting race and religion in Asian Pacific America, right? And both Tammy and I and many of our colleagues, the world of religion wasn't dealing enough with race, and the world of ethnic studies wasn't dealing with enough in terms of religion. And really, to understand Asian Pacific America, you have to focus on religion as well. And so it's interesting, the book is called White Christian Privilege, where I'm trying to show how Christianity has been involved in the construction of whiteness in America, and the way, both Christianity and whiteness are embedded in our legal and social infrastructure. And it is predominantly Asian American history and contemporary events that help to show exactly how this exists. So it is a book for Asian American studies, even though it may not seem like that in terms of the cover of the book. Actually, just at the beginning of May, I think one of the, it's lovely hearing from people across actually the world who've read the book. And this one woman from Taiwan let me know, actually she tweeted that this is a great book if you're wanting to learn more about the Asian Pacific American experience. It's more than that also, right? But the Thind and Ozawa cases, I gotta tell you, I think I could, while I feel like we know so much, I actually feel like there's probably still so much to learn. And it's, religion played a role, Christianity played a role in both of these cases. And for those who are not familiar, these are two cases that went to the United States Supreme Court that determined if Ozawa in 1922 and then Bhagat Singh Thind in 1923 could have citizenship. Because in 1790, Congress had passed a law saying that citizenship was limited to free white. Well, officially the law says free white persons, but we know it means men, So it was limited to free white men. And in 1795, an amendment was made and said, citizenship is limited to free white men of good moral character. Right. And so that really set the tone. And the racial requirement for citizenship was not lifted until 1952. There were, of course, exceptions along the way. African Americans get citizenship in 1868 and the 14th Amendment and a follow-up act. Native Americans received it in 1901 and 1924, though they didn't really want it. Right. And of course, Tammy, you can speak more to that. And then the Chinese actually got it in 1943. And you have to kind of understand history as to why that happened. And while I don't have time to get into all of that, it's interesting. Both the Ozawa case, the justices said that, Mr. Ozawa, you are not Caucasoid, that you are Mongoloid, and therefore not white, and therefore can't be a citizen. And if these words are sounding a little familiar, right, some of us know Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Negroid, these are terms that come out of quote unquote pseudoscience, out of, scientific racism, big air quotes there, folks, big air quotes. This whole field, right, where people were trying to prove, scholars were trying to prove the absolute superiority of white people and the inferiority of Black people, and then everybody else kind of fell in between. And that was the science of the time. And that is what the justices were relying upon in the Ozawa decision. And so the Thind case, the lawyer said, hey, listen, we gotta look what they did. They relied on science in Ozawa. Well, Bhagat Singh Thind was a Sikh man. He had a turban and wore a long beard. And he actually received citizenship upon discharge from the army. And then the United States government actually filed an appeal. I'm truncating the whole story in the interest of time. Ultimately, it goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, so let me back up. The lawyers for Thind said, this man is a high caste Hindu coming from present day North India, parts of Pakistan, that whole area. It was believed that the people who lived there were Aryans. If you're thinking, is she referring to Hitler Aryan? Yes, I am. That's the Aryan I'm referring to. It was believed that the folks who live in present day North India, parts of Pakistan, even Afghanistan, descended from the Caucasus Mountains, and therefore were called Aryans, were considered to be Caucasian. So his lawyers said he's a high caste Hindu. By the way, it didn't matter what religious background you were at the time, everybody was called Hindu. And the lawyers argued that, look, he's actually Caucasian. So the Supreme Court in 1923 said that Thind might be Caucasian, but he is not white, as the common man understands him to be. And he was denied citizenship. And this was really very tragic, because actually the citizenship that some others had received because they had petitioned or sued the courts between 1870 and 1923, those who were South Asian, their citizenships were also revoked. And so it was pretty devastating. So this is, those of us, if you're listening and you went to school in the United States, that we have our pantheon of cases that we've learned, Dred Scott, Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown v. Board. These two cases belong in that pantheon of cases in terms of understanding race in America. So I think that, Tammy, it's showing all of this, kind of showing a different dimension to some of the history that's known. And of course, then showing all this other history that a lot of folks don't know. That's been really gratifying for me, because it's helping people make sense of the issues that we have in our country today, and I think what's really interesting is more and more people I'm meeting have heard of these cases, and students want to know about these cases. And one of the things we are absolutely seeing this year, right, is this intense, increased activism from our Asian Pacific American young folks, folks on college campuses and out in the community as well. This is actually not limited to young people. And I was wondering what you're seeing, because, you know, it's kind of interesting having both of us on the coasts here.
Yeah, no, I agree that I think, you know, this last year has definitely, you know, woken up a generation of young people to the need to, you know, speak out and intervene in these, you know, constant, you know, and debilitating cycles of violence and death, right, and harm. You know, the kind of turnout, right, after George Floyd at the beginning of the pandemic around Black Lives Matter has been, you know, really exciting. And definitely, I think, you know, this past year has been this generation's kind of Vincent Chin moment, right? For, you know, when we were growing up, right, the murder of Vincent Chin in the 80s by, you know, two out of work white auto workers really galvanized, you know, our generation of Asian Americans to realize that, yeah, we weren't, you know, being regarded as equal to all other Americans and to our neighbors, right? So, you know, I think there's been a lot of activism. And I think, you know, also what's so exciting is the way in which social media and, you know, kind of the alliances across race and, you know, models by young, you know, biracial and multiracial Americans has really pushed us to think, you know, much more critically about these categories of race and ethnicity in the United States. Kind of along those lines, I just wanted to kind of remind everybody that today, May 19th, is actually the birthday of a very famous activist named Yuri Kochiyama, right? A Japanese American woman who didn't actually become a political activist until her 40s. And when she moved to Harlem, New York, after being interned, right, during World War II with her family, and moving to Harlem exposed her to the Black Panthers and Malcolm X. And she actually started admiring Malcolm X and studying his, you know, speeches, and ended up writing to him, and he wrote back, and they actually became really incredibly close friends. And so for me, you know, Yuri and Malcolm, and by the way, it's both Malcolm and Yuri's birthday, in addition to Ho Chi Minh and Lorraine Hansberry's birthday. You know, I think is for me, you know, so inspiring in terms of historical example of interracial solidarity, passionate activism. And for those who are interested in finding out a little bit more about Yuri, there's actually a fantastic documentary called Mountains That Take Wing, which features Yuri in conversation with Angela Davis, another very famous African-American activist. And although they're very different generations, they have this really, you know, wonderful conversation about their different political paths, and they discover all these intersections, all the ways in which their lives crossed before they actually met each other in person, working on the same campaigns or working with the same activists to try and work towards social justice. So, you know, I hope, and I, in my classes, as well as, you know, in my work, I encourage students to think about Asian Americans and race beyond just kind of, you know, the separate pie slice, you know, model that people think is, you know, at the heart of ethnic studies, right? Some people call it the 5 food groups, where, you know, you study Chicano studies, you study Black studies, you study Native studies, and then Asian American studies. But in fact, you know, as your book points out, you know, race and religion are so, you know, entwined, right, in US history in terms of forms of marginalization, forms of recognition, citizenship, eligibility. But yeah, so I always push my students to kind of look beyond the usual suspects, right? Like when I teach about Asian American literature, I start with Sui Sin Far, who was biracial. She was British and Chinese, writing in the 1800s. But speaking of teaching, I was wondering if, maybe you wanted to talk a little bit about, what's going on right now in education and kind of, what you think Asian American studies can kind of bring to the table, particularly with all the kind of misinformation and disinformation about critical race theory right now, right? And the way in which it's being used to try and censor teachers from talking about race and inequality in the United States.
Oh, I think, yeah, I would actually go as far as I think critical race theory is kind of being weaponized. People don't understand it. First and foremost, one of the things that when I do my work with educators, whether it's my students or when I'm working with teachers and administrators in school districts and independent schools, is I'm telling them it's very important to remember that critical race theory is a methodology, not an ideology, right? It is a way we approach the law. One of the ways I describe it is like, here's the law and we're looking at the impact, or you can also think of it as the underbelly of the law, and that's what we're talking about with critical race theory. And so, yeah, it is, and it's something we've been doing. And now all of a sudden, because of what the previous administration and the president tried doing in terms of saying it's not okay to teach about these things, it's created a storm where we didn't need one. Really, it's ridiculous. Now, Asian American studies, and I'm going to use that phrase short to kind of talk about how we really, in K through 12 education, need to bring in more Asian Pacific American experiences. When in New Jersey, they talk about immigration in 3rd and 4th grade. That would be a perfect place to bring it in, right? In literature, one of the things I saying to my middle school and high school social studies teachers is like, can we go from teaching it chronologically to also teaching it thematically? So if we're talking about Dred Scott and citizenship, that's a perfect place to also bring in Thind and Ozawa to talk about how those who, for a variety of reasons, and let's connect the dots, could not have citizenship. And then, well, what's the common denominator? The common denominator is the development of whiteness, right? And students being able to see that right now, people, so many times people have this very negative visceral reaction to white privilege. Well, what is white privilege? It's a product of systemic racism, right? But if you don't understand systemic racism, then it's no wonder you don't understand what privilege is and where it comes from. So I really, I'm trying to work with various activists here in New Jersey and my colleagues and work with our policymakers to try to get more of ethnic studies in general and Asian American studies into our curricula. I mean, we have in New Jersey here, Tammy, the Amistad Commission, where we're supposed to be teaching about, that provide all these resources to teach about the African American and Black experience. And it's just, it's not always being done, let's put it that way. And so that's what I want to devote my time to, and really making that happen. And I think right now we have the momentum, and we can do that. But I need people to take a breath about critical race theory and really try to understand what it is. It's about seeing the law and what's the real impact of the law. Our laws are not race neutral. They are not gender neutral. They are not religion neutral, right? So I think, and that's what, that's what spoke to me about Asian American studies, even though I didn't have that language. Asian American studies helped me make sense of my life. and growing up in Atlanta, Georgia, where not many people looked like me, prayed like me, or anything like that. I imagine maybe it was like that for you. But, what has drawn you to Asian American studies? And actually, you do a lot of comparative ethnic studies work, which I think is so important and so needed.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. So what drew me to Asian American studies? I guess, as I mentioned, I didn't have a language and vocabulary growing up for, what my family was. I actually, just thought we were kind of this weird immigrant family. And as I mentioned earlier, I didn't have the framework of Asian American studies, but, I did have professors who were fabulous and, really well trained in Chicana studies and Black studies and Native studies. And they really opened up the door for me in terms of, giving me works that weren't specifically about being Asian American, but spoke to different forms of marginalization or being on the borderland, right? Kind of a double consciousness of, seeing my immigrant family at home and the contrast with kind of, life at school or life at work. And I love how, Asian American studies really, gives us a kind of, I guess, an analytical framework, but also, this kind of thinking back to the way in which in, the 1960s, when the Third World Liberation Strike, brought Asian American graduate students and undergrads together with revolutionaries from, around the world, kind of thinking about, imperialism, war, and decolonization in really kind of critical and international, transnational ways, it was just really powerful. I mean, I feel like I spent a lot of my undergrad kind of searching for, the tools to kind of articulate my family's experience or the experience of Burmese immigrants and refugees and the Burmese diaspora. And one of the things I love about Asian American studies is its expansiveness, its kind of transnational framework, and the way in which it is about kind of finding both points of commonality as well as understanding points of difference, right? One of the things that I was struck by, I just was reading an article yesterday about this new survey put out by Launch, which is leading Asian Americans to Unite for Change, just put out a survey of, they surveyed about 2,700 US residents between March and April of this last year. And they found that 42% of them could not name a famous Asian American. 42% of Americans couldn't name one famous Asian American, and 80%, 80% of the Asian Americans didn't feel respected and felt like they had experienced discrimination, but from fellow Americans. So,
I mean, there's so many. Right? There's so many, but this whole thing leads me to something that, when we wrote the report from Jersey Promise on the state of Asian America in New Jersey, Jun Choi, former mayor of Edison, and I still remember we met at a Starbucks in Montclair 4 or 5 years ago, and we were like, yeah, we need to do this. Like, there's nothing out there on us in this state, and we make up in New Jersey, Asian Americans make up almost 10% of the population. And if we did the census the way we were all supposed to, when the numbers come out, we could be upwards of 15% of the population in New Jersey. And but the common experience, Tammy, regardless of ethnic background, generational background, folks who were, daycare workers and folks who are professors and everyone else, the common experience is invisibility. And so much of that our experience really just doesn't matter as much, and especially in conversations around diversity and inclusion. And I hear this from my friends in corporate America and in law firms and such. And I think that that's been a struggle, right? That's been a struggle. And I think one of the things we also have to understand is that many immigrant groups, when they come to this country, not just Asians, right, but many immigrant groups who come to this country and refugee groups, everybody wants to succeed, and to be successful is to be like white people. People don't understand how they're racialized, and to talk about race is to be like Black people. And so there's this distance that's kept, right? So we have to also take ownership of that in terms of also thinking about that phenomenon, as well as the anti-Black racism that it can exist, well, that does exist in our own communities, right? And looking at those instances so that we can actually form authentic relationships and really be in solidarity for justice, right, across groups. And I think that we are seeing more and more of that, you know, which is really delightful,
Could we
Any,
turn to Ingrid's question?
yes, what is Ingrid's question? I didn't even see it.
So she typed in the chat, the number of anti-Asian bias incidents has increased dramatically in New Jersey. What can non-Asians do to support Asian American communities right now?
Go for it, because I just took a few minutes.
Okay. Well, I think, you know, one of the things that I've recommended, and, you know, other Asian American academics have recommended, is learning how to be kind of conscious bystanders, or, you know, allies, as it were, right? So Hollaback, for example, has been offering free bystander trainings, you know, over the last year or two. My niece took one. She felt really empowered by it, and they're free. So, you know, I think one of the things is, if you see somebody being harassed or targeted, right, go stand next to them, or, you know, be willing to, you know, kind of ask them how they're doing. Not that you should necessarily confront people who seem dangerous or violent, but, you know, just don't treat them like they're invisible. Don't treat them like, you know, you don't see what's happening when you do see and hear something that, you know, perhaps can you know, that might become dangerous or traumatic. So I think, you know, just being attentive and being willing to, you know, kind of stand next to and notice and listen to Asian Americans is a really important first step. What else do you think would help?
Well, I put the link in the chat box for everybody that could also get shared out onto Facebook and stuff. So yeah, folks really, you know, love that training. I think it's also what we need to do is we need all kinds of folks involved on their talking to their local school boards and pushing. It shouldn't just be the Asian Pacific American parents and families pushing for this being in our K through 12 education, pushing for anti-racist, anti-bias education overall. You know, that's what we really need. We need everybody coming out to those board meetings and saying this is needed. And by the way, let me say, this is not about demonizing teachers. I work with teachers. Teachers, you know, you can only teach that which you know. And if teachers weren't taught it in the first place, or if teachers themselves weren't taught anti-bias education, anti-racist education, then districts have to provide that training and that professional development. So I want to be kind of crystal clear as a teacher educator. I love my teachers. This is not about demonizing the teachers. And here's the other thing. We have amazing curricula out there. You know, right, Tammy? We've got friends and colleagues who've written amazing books. And these books, you know, can be used in high school for sure, right? But it's school boards willing to buy them. It's school boards approving them, you know, literature, you know, Asian American experiences through literature is so important. So I think the other piece of it is the curriculum is out there, but what we know based on data is that you can have great curricula and we can say it's important, but that doesn't mean teachers are using it. If they're not comfortable with using it, or if they're not comfortable being uncomfortable, it's not getting used. It's not getting used. A couple of years ago, Tammy, the group that used to be known as Teaching Tolerance, that is now Learning for Justice, you know, of course, Prince comes to mind when we talk about formerly known as, right? But they did a report called Teaching Hard History. And what they revealed what the report revealed was that when it comes to teaching slavery and Reconstruction, so many instances, teachers really just were trying to get through it as quick as possible, gloss over things. They didn't want the white kids to feel bad. They didn't want the Black kids to feel bad. They didn't know how to deal with all this. And so it just wasn't really getting taught, which is a problem, right? So we know that they need training on these issues. And so that's another thing that parents can be out there. Non-Asian and Americans can be out there. If you believe in equity and justice, if you believe in building that more perfect union, then we need you out there talking to your school boards. That's what I would say.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you about the need to for both parents to, as you mentioned, push for, kind of more diverse curriculum and a kind of wider spectrum of, American history and life to be taught in, K through 12. I'm reminded of comments I've had from students, one when I was teaching at University of Iowa and one when I was teaching in California here at UC Riverside. I had students actually come up to me and say, I didn't know that Asians suffered from racism. I'm in shock. You're the first person I've ever met in my life that taught me that. And so, I realized that my colleagues weren't teaching Asian American works to these students because the students hadn't heard about it until they met me and took my classes, right?
There's a question for you.
Oh,
For Dr. Ho. Do you still live in Myanmar? If not, would you visit or return considering the current climate?
well, no, I don't live in Myanmar. I live here in Riverside, California. As you can see, I have my campus behind me. So my family left Myanmar in the early 1970s. And part of the reason we left was because there was a military coup, not unlike what happened in February of this year, back in 1962. And when that dictator took over, he was interested in kind of this ethno-nationalist, take Burma back for the Burmans. And even though Burma is one of the most diverse, countries of Southeast Asia in general is very racially and ethnically diverse, as religiously diverse as well.
Yes.
That there were actually laws passed saying if you were Chinese, you couldn't go to college. And this was kind of revenge on the Chinese because they were assumed to have power under the British colonial rule and getting unfair advantages, unlike, the indigenous and native populations who were treated differently, right? So my dad wanted me to be educated. He wanted his children to be educated. So my family got out of Burma and moved to the United States, as did many Burmese of Sikh, Muslim, Chinese, mixed race descent, right? And then would I go back? Yes, I would go back. I have gone back. But when we first left, there was actually a rule as well. If you leave the country, don't ever come back, because there was a fear of foreign ideas, and particularly Western ideas, coming back into the country and causing political unrest. So my family actually was not allowed to return to Burma until 1997, when the country kind of went bankrupt and reopened to try and invite back all the people who had been kicked out, who were now successful in, other parts of the world. So I would go back. Right now would be quite dangerous, obviously. So that's my answer. Let's see.
Okay. Well, what I was going to say, and Nadine, do we have other questions?
Yes, we do. So
Excellent.
let's see, there's a few from Facebook. There are questions and comments. The first I'll read out is, as a Black man that lives in Newark and have experienced the Newark Public Library many times over in my life, both as a student and as a participant in programs there, this event brings a certain sadness to my soul. I work in television. I find that some of the attackers are Black. This breaks my heart. Is this mental illness, social insecurity, or just ignorance? As a suppressed community in the United States, I just cannot fathom why this would happen.
Kathy, you want to take that first?
I couldn't catch, can you read the second half again, Nadine? I couldn't get it.
I find that some of the attackers are Black. This breaks my heart. Is this mental illness, social insecurity, or just ignorance? As a suppressed community in the United States, I just cannot fathom why this would happen.
Well, I think what I'm there with you. It makes me so sad too. I think it is, all of the reasons you said, and also the fact that, listen, all of us have bias. Everybody has bias. None of us are immune from it. And people develop their biases. And if they say this, and listen, when you have the former president of the United States talking about Kung flu and Wuhan virus and government officials repeating it over and over. And, often we see incidences like this when fear has been stoked and people are suffering, then we have to blame somebody, right? There's scapegoating going on here. And so it's all of those things, but everybody has biases, and that's one of the things that we all have to work on. Now, some people's biases are reinforced by public policy and, Supreme Court decisions and laws that are passed. And so that's what makes the difference, if we're talking about race in America, that's what makes the difference between Black folks, Asian folks, Hispanic folks, and all having bias, and white folks having bias, but their bias is reinforced by some of our, big public policies. So that's what I would say. Tammy?
I would agree that, I think, certain kinds of bias are encouraged and kind of endorsed by public policy, by politicians, and the media. I think the media also plays a big role, right, in terms of which stories make the news, which stories go viral, and which stories do not. Because, every time I've taught about Yuri Kochiyama and Malcolm X, or Grace Lee Boggs and Jimmy Boggs, my students are shocked. They're like, how come we never heard about these, relationships? And because, interracial solidarity does not make big ratings, apparently, right? Even though it's happening on the ground all over the place in various ways across history. The other thing I would mention as well is that I think it's very easy, and like I said, in the media, to emphasize or spotlight Black Asian tension, right? We saw it in the 1992, uprising or / riots in Los Angeles. We've seen it recently, but one of our colleagues, Melissa Borja, who's a professor at University of Michigan, has been doing a project tracking virulent hate incidents in terms of anti-Asian racism and resistance during COVID. And what Melissa found out is actually that the numbers do not support that it's just Blacks coming after Asians. Right? There are people of all colors coming after Asians, unfortunately, because of the political rhetoric and policy kind of emphases that Khyati mentioned. So I would say that, I think during times of intense economic and or psychological crises, right, people who feel disenfranchised want to act out and lash out at easy targets, people who are marked as an appropriate scapegoat, right? But at the same time, I think it's important to look at the data, as Khyati often says, right, in terms of actual, the actual incidents and who's committing them, because it's not just Black folks.
Thank you. We have one last question. The term AAPI encompasses people from many countries with diverse cultures who speak different languages. How hard is it to organize politically?
Oh my goodness, we could talk the entire hour. We could have started with that. That is such a great question. It isn't easy. Tammy, I'm going to speak personally and with my academic hat on and personally, because they combine, and then you can add, the term, like, if you ask me, what I am, we often have that question, like, what are you, right? And what comes to mind, what comes from my heart is I'm Indian American, but I'm also Asian American. And, 20 years ago, it was a bit of a forced identity for me because it didn't feel like that was Asian. To me, Asian American was East Asian America, because that's kind of how it had been depicted. But Asian American is a political identity, and it really is an important one. There's so much actually commonality across Asian Pacific America with all the heterogeneity that there is, and so it can be hard to mobilize because we're talking, we can't just whip out one language for those who are immigrants, right? And we're not going to a couple of different houses of worship. We're talking about every religious background there is, and then some and none, part of Asian Pacific America. And Tammy, I'm so happy you brought up, biracial, multiracial people. And let's also make sure we remember those who are adoptees, right? They are Asian Pacific America. And so it can be very difficult organizing, but I'm seeing more and more happening because there is strength in numbers, and we have commonality of experience. I mean, again, just look at this, anti-Asian hate. Well, the South Asians who experienced a lot of unfortunate things after 9/11, we were right there when all this started happening because we all know what it felt like. And so many of my Asian American friends were right there when what was happening with South Asian Americans, post 9/11. So we see that there is so much commonality, and it's important to have that political identity. Tammy?
Yeah, I actually don't have a whole lot more to add other than, I agree that it's certainly challenging to work across, the lines of ethnicity and politics, but I think that, there is strength in numbers, and, Asian Pacific Americans and Pacific Islanders have understood that, we are can support each other better if we work together, right? So that's not to say that there aren't tensions and that there aren't some need for kind of reckoning around issues of privilege, particularly in the ways in which Pacific Islanders are, in some ways share a lot with Native Americans and Indigenous studies politics around, the need to think about land, right? And the ways in which the Pacific Islands have been, this kind of military testing ground for nuclear weapons and militarization. So in terms of thinking about the Pacific as a place of people, right, and communities, not just an ocean that we fly over or go vacation at when we're trying to escape our homes, is something that Asian American, I think, scholars and activists are trying to be more accountable and more responsible for thinking about the US mainland critically, and what kinds of things we get entangled in terms of US militarism and international relations.
Thank you so much. We're going to begin concluding the program. I want to thank our panelists. You've provided us with so much information on this important and very relevant topic. We also want to thank our participants who listened very carefully and contribute their insights through their questions. We hope that you join us for other panel discussions that will follow in this series. Other topics in this series will focus on cancel culture, the work of Philip Roth in partnership with the Philip Roth Society, and Jewish African American relations as part of the library's annual Black History celebration. Again, thank you for all of you for being with us for this important conversation. We look forward to seeing you at our next discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Nadine. Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.
Thank you.